The Galactic Council chamber was filled with alien beings from across the stars when she walked inside, and everyone stopped talking at once. I guess they had never seen anyone like her before in their entire lives, and some of them had lived for thousands of years already. But this woman was different from everything they knew. Liana moved through the massive doors with grace that seemed impossible, and her silver hair flowed behind her like liquid starlight, while her armor looked like it was made from pieces of the night sky itself. And behind her came something even more shocking. As a dragon followed her into the chamber, and its scales were black as deep space, with eyes that burned like distant suns. The dragon was not small or cute like the creatures some species kept as pets, but massive and deadly and ancient beyond measure, and its name was Nightwing. And together they had traveled across galaxies for reasons no one in the council could understand yet, but they would learn soon enough. The alien leaders sat in their high chairs and looked down at the woman and her dragon with confusion, and some with anger, because Earth was not an important planet in their eyes, and humans were considered weak and primitive compared to the great civilizations that ruled the galaxy for millions of years. Katie Morrison stepped forward from the shadows where she had been waiting, and she wore the uniform of the United Earth Defense Force, and while her clothes were simple compared to the shining robes and armor of the alien council members, her eyes were hard as steel, and her jaw was set with determination that made even the dragon pause for just a moment. Katie was not tall or imposing like many of the aliens in the room, but she carried herself like someone who had seen battle and survived and learned from it, and when she spoke her voice was calm, but everyone could hear the anger beneath her words. For 50 years, we have asked you nicely to stop your attacks on our colonies, and Katie said each word carefully so there would be no misunderstanding, and for 50 years, you have ignored us, or laughed at us, or told us that humans are too weak to matter in galactic affairs. The insect creatures, called the Vexstar, clicked their mandibles in amusement because they had raided human settlements many times and taken people to sell in their flesh markets, and they did not think Earth could do anything to stop them. The crystal beings called the Luminae glowed with cold light and calculated probabilities in their processor minds, and their numbers told them that humans were not a threat and could be ignored safely. Massive warrior race called the Croth laughed the loudest because they were the strongest beings in the known galaxy, and they had crushed 1,000 civilizations under their boots and eaten the bones of their enemies, and humans seemed like insects to them. One of the Croth leaders stood up, and his armor clanked with the weight of 100 battles, and he pointed at Katie with a claw that could tear through metal and said, "What will you do, little human, because your species has no magic and no ancient weapons, and you are barely worth our attention?" Roared, and the sound shook the entire council chamber and made the walls vibrate, and several of the alien delegates fell backward in their chairs as the dragon filled their minds with visions of burning worlds and shattered fleets and civilizations. Turned to ash, and Dusliana raised one hand, and the dragon became quiet again, but his eyes still burned with fury, and she looked at the Croth warrior with a smile that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. "You misunderstand our relationship completely," and Liana said in a voice that seemed to echo from the beginning of time itself. And humanity did not summon us with magic spells, and they did not bind us with ancient chains, and they did not conquer us in battle. We chose them, and that simple statement hung in the air like a death sentence, and we chose humanity because they are worth protecting and worth teaching and worth standing beside when the galaxy finally learns what happens when you push peaceful people to far. Katie activated a holographic display that showed dozens of human colony worlds, and each one was marked with a red symbol that indicated an attack by alien forces, and children had died in those attacks, and families had been torn apart, and people had been taken as slaves. "These are the sites of your last attacks on human civilians," and Katie said while pointing to each red mark, "and you have 30 days to remove every hostile force from human space, and after that we will show you what happens when politeness runs out." Liana stepped closer to the council members, and Nightwing moved with her like a living shadow, and the elf woman looked each alien leader in the eyes one by one. "I have lived since before your species learned to make fire," and she said quietly, "and I have seen empires rise and fall like waves on an ocean, and I have watched as proud civilizations made the same mistake you are making right now. They thought mercy was weakness, and they thought patience was cowardice. And they thought that because someone chooses peace, they are incapable of war, in every single one of those. Civilizations is now gone and turned to dust, and remembered only in the songs. I sing to myself on lonely nights. The council chamber was completely silent now, because even the most arrogant aliens could feel the weight of ages pressing down on them from this strange woman and her. Dragonite Wing spoke directly into their minds without using words, and his thoughts were fire and ice at the same time, and he said, "We are the last of the star drakes, and the final elves of the forgotten stars, and we have ended threats that would make your greatest. Warriors weep like children, but we chose humanity not because they are strong, but because they have potential, and not because they are wise, but because they want to learn, and not because they are. Fearless, but because they fight anyway, even when they are afraid." Katie looked at the assembled aliens with disgust and said, "You had 50 years to do the right thing, and you chose cruelty instead, and you chose to see kindness as weakness and negotiation as surrender. And now you will learn that humans can be kind. Or humans can be deadly, but you do not get to choose both 30 days." And Liana repeated, and her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the massive chamber. "And after 30 days, we will come for you, and we will show you why the forgotten stars are forgotten, and why the star drakes are the last of lead. Their kind it is because we ended the threats that came before you, and we made examples that lasted for millions of years, and we taught the universe that some lines should never be crossed." The dragon spread his wings, and they seemed to fill the entire room with shadow, and for just a moment every alien in the council saw a vision of what would come if they did not heed the warning, and they saw human soldiers, trained by ancient elves and armed with weapons designed by dragon fire and sea, backed by powers older than their oldest legends. The vision faded, and Katie and Liana and Nightwing turned to leave, and as they walked toward the massive doors, Katie said over her shoulder without looking back, 30 days, and then Politeness ends, and war begins, and you will learn why we are worth protecting." The Vexstar Queen did not believe the warning was real, and she thought the elf and her dragon were bluffing, because the Vexstar had conquered hundreds of worlds and enslaved thousands of species, and no one had ever stopped them before. So why would these humans be any different from all the others who had begged for mercy? 3 days after the council meeting, the Vexstar swarm descended on New Haven colony like a dark cloud, and there were 10,000 warriors with bioweapons and acid sprayers, and claws sharp enough to cut through steel, and they had come to harvest human children for their flesh markets, just like they had done twice before them. Human farmers saw them coming and locked their doors and hid in their basements with their families, and they prayed that someone would save them because they had no weapons strong enough to fight the Vexstar and no training to stand against such numbers. But when the Vexstar warriors landed in the center of the settlement, they found Liana waiting for them, and she stood alone in the middle of the town square with her twin swords hanging at her sides and her silver hair moving in the wind, even though there was no wind. "That day, where is your dragon?" the Vexstar commander hissed through his translator. "And where are your human soldiers, and where are your mighty weapons? Because we see only one female standing against 10,000 of the greatest." Warriors in the Galaxalina smiled and said, "Nightwing is everywhere I need him to be, and the humans are watching from above and learning what I am about to teach them about fighting creatures like you." Maya Brooks circled overhead in her fighter, along with 12 other pilots, and they had orders to watch and record everything that happened, because this was not just a battle, but a lesson, and Katie Morrison herself had told them to pay attention to every detail. Vexstar swarm attacked all at once, and they rushed forward with mandibles clicking and weapons firing and acid spraying through the air, and it seemed impossible that one person could survive such an assault, even if that person was an ancient elf with magic powers. But Liana moved like water flowing around rocks, and she was never where the attacks landed, and her swords sang as they cut through chitin armor and severed limbs and found the weak points in Vexstar biology with perfect precision. Every single time noticed the joint weakness here. She called up to Maya and the other pilots while cutting through 3 warriors at once, and their armor is strongest at the thorax, but the neck junction is vulnerable to thermal weapons, so aim there. When you fight them, Maya recorded everything and watched in amazement as Liana fought without, seeming to tire and without wasting a single movement, and it was like watching a deadly dance where every step had meaning and purpose. Plasma Blast hit Liana in the shoulder and burned through her armor, but she barely seemed to notice the pain. And she kept fighting while explaining their communication works through pheromones. So if you disrupt the Queen's signal, they lose coordination and become confused. The Vexstar kept coming in waves and Liana kept cutting them down while teaching Maya and the other pilots exactly how to kill these creatures and where their weaknesses were and what tactics worked best against their swarm attacks then. The sky went dark and Nightwing fell from the clouds like a meteor made of shadow and fury. And his wings were so large they blocked out the sun, and his roar made the ground shake beneath their feet. Dragon landed among the Vexstar warriors, and his flames were not normal fire, but something far more terrible, and where his breath touched. The aliens, they simply ceased to exist and were turned into less than atoms and scattered on the wind. But Maya noticed something important as she watched from above, and Nightwing was holding back his full power and deliberately leaving survivors who could run away and spread word of what happened here today. The battle ended quickly after that, and the Vexstar who survived fled in terror back to their ships, and Liana stood in the scorched earth breathing normally like she had just taken a walk instead of fighting 10,000 warriors. Maya landed her fighter nearby and walked over to the elf woman with respect and confusion mixing in her mind. "Why did you teach us your fighting technique?" she asked, "and why not just end this yourself and save us the trouble of learning?" Liana looked at the young pilot with eyes that held the weight of ages and said, "Because Nightwing and I will not live forever, even though we have lived for a very long time already, and eventually we will fade away and become memories and myths, but humanity will continue." And she said while putting a hand on Maya's shoulder, "And when we are gone, you need to be able to defend yourselves against threats like the Vexstar and worse things that exist in the dark spaces between stars. We did not choose humanity because you were already strong." And Liana continued, "And we chose you because you were worth making strong and because you have the potential to become something greater than you are." Now Maya understood then that this was about more than just one battle or one colony, and it was about preparing humanity for a future without their ancient protectors. Nightwing shrank down to the size of a large dog and walked over to them, and his thoughts entered their minds gently, and he said, "Teach others what you learned today and spread this knowledge to every human soldier and make sure our lessons are not forgotten." The dragon looked at Maya with eyes that burned with ancient fire and continued by saying, "We give you the tools, but you must learn to use them, and we show you the way, but you must walk the path yourselves." Maya saluted both of them and said, "I will make sure every pilot in the fleet knows what I learned here today, and we will be ready when you are." Liana smiled sadly and said, "That is all we can ask, and that is why we chose your species above all others, because you learn quickly and adapt and survive, no matter what the galaxy throws at." Youth farmers of New Haven came out of their homes slowly and saw the devastation around them and the scorched earth where thousands of Vexstar had died, and they understood that something had changed in the balance of power. One old farmer approached Liana and asked, "Art you an angel sent from heaven to protect us?" Liana laughed softly and said, "No, I am much older than angels and much more dangerous, but I am your friend, and that is what matters." She looked up at the sky where Vexstar ships were fleeing and said, "They will tell others what happened here, and word will spread across the galaxy that humanity is not defenseless anymore." Maya returned to her fighter and prepared to head back to base, and as she lifted off, she saw Liana and Nightwing standing together in the ruins of the battlefield, and they looked like figures from ancient legends come to life. The lesson had been taught, and now it would spread throughout the human military, and soon every soldier would know how to fight the Vexstar, and how to exploit their weaknesses, and how to win against impossible odds. This was just the beginning, and there were more lessons to come. The Lumine Collective was a species that prided themselves on pure logic and mathematical perfection, and their bodies were made of living crystal that housed processors capable of calculating billions of outcomes every second, and they had never made a decision based on emotion or instinct in their entire existence. When they analyzed the warning from Liana and Earth, Their probability matrices told them there was a 73.4% chance the elf and dragon were bluffing, and a 94.7% chance humans would negotiate before resorting to actual violence. The numbers gave them confidence, and the Luminae trusted numbers more than anything else in the universe. Captain Dana Hayes commanded the Earth vessel Valiant when the Luminae decided to test their calculations and sent a harvester fleet to strip mine the asteroid colonies, where human workers extracted rare elements that were needed for building ships and stations the Luminae had done this before many times, and they always ignored human property rights because their mathematical models said the economic benefit outweighed any political cost, and humans had always backed down in the past, but this time was different because Liana came with Dana and her crew. You do not have to be here, Dana told the elf woman as they watched the Luminae fleet approach on their view screen, and my crew can handle this situation ourselves. Liana smiled while scratching behind Nightwing ear ridges, and the dragon was currently the size of a large dog in the ship-ready room, and he rumbled contentedly at the attention can. You handle them, Liana asked gently, and the Luminae think in pure logic and mathematics, and sometimes logic needs to meet something it cannot calculate or predict. The Luminae broadcast their demands across all frequencies, and they wanted immediate cessation of mining operations and transfer of all extracted materials and reparations for what they called illegal use of collective claims. Spaced their mathematical proofs of ownership, filled entire data streams, and each argument was precisely constructed with references to ancient laws and treaties that humans had never agreed to. Dana's response was simple and direct, and she just said, "No." Luminae attack ships moved forward with their crystalline hulls refracting starlight into deadly focused beam weapons, and they had calculated the exact amount of force needed to disable the human vessel without destroying it completely, because they wanted the rare elements intact. Dana crew had trained for this exact scenario, and human tactical doctrine emphasized speed and unpredictability and creative solutions that cold logic struggled to anticipate or counter effectively. But it was Liana who turned the battle into something the Luminae could never have calculated. She stood at the viewport with her eyes closed and began to sing, and the sound was something beyond normal music or language, and it was harmony made manifest, and it was a frequency that resonated with the quantum vibrations of reality itself. The Luminae ships began to shatter from the inside. Their crystalline holes started developing cracks and fractures, and their perfect geometric structures began tearing themselves apart because Liana's song had found the exact resonance frequency that made their greatest strength come their greatest weakness. One by one, the Luminae vessels fractured and broke, and their crews ejected in escape pods as their ships became glittering debris floating in space like diamonds scattered across black velvet. When the singing stopped and silence returned, Dana stared in complete awe at what she had just witnessed. "How did you do that?" Dana asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. Liana opened her eyes, and they reflected starfields that no longer existed and galaxies that had died billions of years ago. And she said, "I am old, Captain, and I am older than your species recorded history by a factor you cannot imagine. I have had time to learn the songs of elements and the harmonies of matter itself, and how to make reality vibrate in ways that can build or destroy." And she paused and looked at Dana with ancient sadness. "But that is not what I am teaching you today." Nightwing grew larger until his head filled half the ready room, and his presence was overwhelming, and his voice rumbled directly into their minds without using sound. "The lesson the dragon thought spoke, and is that every strength is also a weakness, and the Luminae perfect logic made them brittle and predictable, and unable to adapt when something unexpected happened. The brittleness in your enemies," Nightwing continued, "and you do not need to be the strongest to win, and you only need to be smart enough to see what they cannot see about themselves." Dana nodded slowly, and her tactical mind was already spinning out implications and applications, and she understood that this was not just about fighting the Luminae, but about a whole new way of thinking about conflict. "You are training us," Dana said, "and not just to fight, but to think like you do, and to see patterns and weaknesses that we would miss on our own better." Liana corrected gently, "And we are training you to think like yourselves, but with the wisdom of ages behind. You and humanity adaptability is your greatest gift, and you can learn and change faster than any species we have ever encountered. Our knowledge simply accelerates what you would eventually discover on your own, and she continued, and we are just giving you a head start so you can defend yourselves after we are. Gondana looked at the debris field that had been Luminae ships and asked, will they attack again? Liana said with certainty, and they are creatures of logic and calculation, and they will recalculate their probability matrices and realize that attacking humanity is no longer cost-effective. The Luminae will spread word across the galaxy that humans are protected by powers they cannot defeat through logic alone. And Nightwing added, and that message will reach species who rely on cold calculation and perfect planning. Dana crew gathered around to hear what had happened, and Liana spent the next hour teaching them about resonance frequencies and quantum harmonics and how to find the hidden weaknesses in seemingly perfect systems. She could not teach them to sing like she did because that required magic and ages of practice, but she could teach them the principles behind it and how to apply similar concepts using human technology and weapons. By the time the lesson was over, Dana crew understood something fundamental and important, and they understood that winning was not always about having bigger guns or stronger armor. Sometimes winning was about understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves and finding the one perfect weakness that could bring down an entire fleet. The Valiant returned to Earth space with new knowledge and new tactics, and Dana immediately began writing training manuals and giving lectures to other captains about what she had learned. The lessons spread through the human fleet like wildfire, and soon every tactical officer was studying resonance theory and looking for ways to turn enemy strengths into weakness. As Liana and Nightwing watched from a distance, and they were pleased because humanity was learning exactly what they needed to survive in a hostile galaxy. 30-day deadline was approaching, and more species would learn their lessons soon. The Kroth Dominion had ruled through pure strength for 3,000 years, and their entire civilization was built on one simple principle: that might makes right and the strongest take what they want from the weak. They were massive warriors who stood 3 meters tall, with natural armor thick enough to stop bullets and claws that could tear through steel like paper, and they had conquered, enslaved, and consumed hundreds of lesser species across the galaxy for 3,000 years. The Kroth had never known defeat, and they had never retreated from battle, and they had never felt the cold grip of fear in their hearts. Warlord crossed the Undying lead, a raiding party to the human colony of Riverside, and he expected easy prey like all the times before, and he brought 500 of his best warriors with him, and they wore armor decorated with the bones of their enemies. Instead, a frightened farmer's cross found Lieutenant Colonel Beth Morgan and her mechanized infantry battalion waiting for them, and the soldiers stood in formation with weapons ready and power, armor gleaming in the sunlight. But more importantly, Nightwing was there watching from atop the central tower. The dragon had his wings folded and made no move to attack or interfere, and he just sat there like a statue made of shadow and ancient power, and his presence was a weight that pressed down on everyone. Below, why does the dragon not attack? Cross demanded through his translator, and his voice was a growl that would make most species run in terror. Beth stood at the front of her battalion, and her power armor was already scored with plasma burns from previous battles, and she grinned behind her helmet and said, because he does not need to, and we have got this handled ourselves. The Kroth warriors laughed at her confidence, and they had crushed armies 10 times larger than this small human force, and they did not think these soldiers could stand against true warriors who had been bred for battle. The fighting began, and it was savage and brutal, and the Kroth charged forward with war cries that shook the ground, and they swung massive weapons that could shatter tanks with a single blow. But Beth's soldiers fought with precision they had learned from Liana, and they moved like water flowing around obstacles, and they targeted the weak points in Kroth anatomy that the elf had shown them. During training, the Kroth were stronger and more massive, and their natural armor was incredibly thick. But Beth's battalion used their enemy strength against them and made the Kroth momentum work in humanity favor. When a Kroth warrior charged Beth directly with a warhammer that could crush buildings, she did not try to block the attack or meet it with force, and instead, she sidestepped at the last possible second and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the ground. Then she placed a shaped charge exactly where Liana had taught her the Croth's spinal interface was most vulnerable, and the explosion was small and precise, and the mighty warrior fell paralyzed but alive all across the battlefield. The same scene repeated itself, and human soldiers dodged and weaved and struck at weak points, and the Croth found themselves unable to land solid hits on these fast-moving targets. Cross himself joined the battle, and he was the largest and strongest of all. The Croth warriors and he had personally killed over 1,000 enemies in single combat, and he had never been defeated. Swung his massive axe at Beth, and the weapon moved so fast it screamed through the air, and any normal person would have been cut in half. But Beth had trained with Liana for months. She rolled under the swing and came up behind Cross and placed another shaped charge at the base of his skull, where the armor plates met, and the explosion dropped the mighty warlord like a falling tree. Cross lay on the ground, unable to move, and he stared up in disbelief, because this had never happened to him before in 3,000 years of conquest and war. Liana descended from the tower on Nightwing back, and they landed with impossible gentleness beside the fallen Croth leader, and she dismounted and approached him and knelt to look into his eyes. For 3,000 years, Liana said softly, and your species has believed that strength is measured in muscle and fury, and the ability to crush your enemies through sheer force. But you've never faced someone who was stronger than you, and chose mercy instead. And she gestured to Beth and her soldiers, who stood ready but had not delivered killing blows to their defeated enemies. Humanity is teaching you something new today, Warlord, and they are teaching you fear and not fear of death. Because you Croth welcome death in battle, but fear of being proven wrong about everything you believe. Nightwing, that's washed over the entire battlefield and touched every mind present, both human and Croth, and his mental voice was terrible and beautiful at the same time. We are ancient, the dragon said, and we have ended species that numbered in the trillions, and we have turned suns cold and made planets weep, and we have destroyed threats that would give your worst nightmares fear. But we chose to stand with these young, fragile humans, not because they are powerful, but because they understand something you have forgotten. And that thing is that true strength is knowing when not to use it. Beth removed her helmet and looked down at Cross with something that was not quite pity, but also not quite contempt. You can take a message back to your dominion, she said, and tell them that Earth does not want your territory, and we do not want to conquer you, and we just want to be left alone. But if you keep pushing, she continued, and well, our friends here have been very, very patient with you, and do not mistake that patience for weakness or inability to fight back. The Croth warriors were allowed to gather their wounded in return to their ships, and they carried Cross on a stretcher, and for the first time in their long history, they were retreating from a battlefield. As they left, each Croth warrior looked back at Liana and Nightwing with a new emotion burning in their hearts. And it was respect born from fear, and fear born from understanding that they had finally met something they could not defeat. Beth approached Liana and said, thank you for the training, and without what you taught us, we would have been crushed. Liana smiled and said, you did the work, and you learned the lessons, and you applied them perfectly. And that is what matters most. Nightwing shrunk back down and said, tell other human soldiers what happened here today, and spread the knowledge of how to defeat the Croth, and make sure every battalion knows their weaknesses. Promised she would, and over the following weeks, she traveled to every human military base and taught them what she had learned. And soon the entire Earth Defense Force knew how to fight. The mighty Croth word spread across the galaxy that the Croth had been defeated, and that the unbeatable warriors had retreated in fear, and species that had cowered before the Dominion for thousands of years began to whisper about change. The Croth themselves held emergency council meetings and debated what to do about humanity and their ancient protectors, and for the first time they considered the possibility that conquest might not be the answer. Cross recovered from his paralysis, but he was changed by the experience, and he had felt true fear and true respect, and he understood now that strength came in many forms. The lesson had been taught, and the galaxy's strongest warriors had learned humility, and the 30-day deadline was almost here. 6 months had passed since the council meeting, and the galaxy major powers gathered again, but not in the Grand Council chamber this time, and instead they met on a small moon, where Liana and Nightwing had made their temporary home. Admiral Katie Morrison represented Earth, but she was not alone because Maya Brooks and Dana Hayes and Beth Morgan stood with her, and each woman bore scars from their battles, and each carried herself with confidence that made the alien delegates uncomfortably honored. Waited for them in a garden she had grown in impossible flowers, bloomed under alien stars in colors that should not exist, painted the landscape, and Nightwing coiled around an ancient tree with his size somewhere between a fighter craft and a small cruiser. "You called us here," the new Vexstar Queen said, and her tone was far more respectful than her predecessor, who had died screaming in dragonfire, "and we have withdrawn from human space, as you demanded, as have we." The Lumine representative said, and its crystalline voice was subdued and quiet even. The Croth delegation bowed their massive heads, and this was a gesture their species had not made to anyone in living memory, and Cross the Undying himself led them, and he walked with a slight limp from his battle with Bethliana stood, and the garden seemed to hold its breath, and every flower turned toward her as if she were the sun, and she said, "I asked you here not to gloat and not to threaten, but to explain something important. You need to understand what you have been playing with," she continued, "and you need to know the truth about Nightwing and myself, and why we chose humanity above all others." She gestured, and the air shimmered with magic, and images formed showing worlds beyond counting, and civilizations that had risen and fallen, and empires that had spanned galaxies, now reduced to whispers and dust. Nightwing and I are old, Liana said quietly, and we watched your species' ancestors crawl from their first seas, and we have seen 1,000 galactic cycles, and we have witnessed the birth and death of entire realities we could have chosen anyone to share our knowledge with, she continued, and gods know that species far more powerful than yours have begged for our favor and offered us wealth beyond measure. The dragon voice resonated through every mind present, and he said, "We chose humanity, not because they were strong, but because they were kind to those weaker than themselves, not because they were wise." Nightwing continued, "But because they wanted to learn and ask questions and admitted when they did not know, not because they were fearless, but because they fought anyway, even when they were terrified, and even when victory seemed impossible." Caddy stepped forward, and her voice carried despite her smaller size compared to the massive aliens, and she said, "For 50 years, we asked nicely, and we negotiated, and we compromised, and we tried to be good neighbors to all of you. You mistook that for weakness," Katie continued, "and you thought because we had not unleashed weapons of mass destruction that we did not have them, and you thought because we valued life, we could not take it when necessary. But now you know better," Maya added in her pilot eyes were hard and cold, "and you have seen that we can fight, and that we will fight when pushed to forend, that we learned from the best teachers in the galaxy," Dana said, "and we learned from beings who have forgotten more about war than your species will ever know." Beth crossed her arms and smiled slightly and said, "So here is the final warning, and this time there will not be another chance, and stay out of human space completely. Do not raid our colonies, and do not enslave our people, and do not treat us like we are insignificant, because we are not alone anymore." Beth continued. Liana's expression softened, and something almost like sadness crossed her ancient features, and she said, "I wish it had not come to this, and I wish you had listened to their peaceful requests. But perhaps this is the only language the powerful truly understand," she continued, "and the language of consequences, and the lesson learned through painite." Wing rose and spread his wings, and they blotted out the stars, and his presence suddenly became overwhelming and crushing, and several delegates fell to their knees under the "Why, humanity politeness has limits," the dragon said, "and our patience has limits, and if you cross those limits again, you will learn something terribly. Will learn that we chose humanity not despite their capacity for violence, but because they have that capacity and usually choose to restrain it." Nightwing continued, "But usually is not the same as always," he finished, and his eyes blazed with fire that could burn galaxies. The dragon voice dropped to something that resembled a growl, and he said, "Test them again, And you will not face soldiers who have trained for months. You will face soldiers who have learned from us for generations, and you will face a species that combines their adaptability with our ancient knowledge. We'll face a human civilization that we have chosen to uplift and protect and guide. An arm with powers beyond your comprehension and worst of all, Liana said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every ear. And you will face us, and not as teachers, and not as mentors, and not holding back to make a point. 2. We'll face the forgotten stars, and the last star Drake unleashed. She continued, in fighting alongside the species we have chosen to protect with our full power, and the galaxy will burn. Nightwing finished, and his mental voice was absolute, and final silence stretched across the garden, and no one moved, and no one spoke, and the weight of the threat hung in the air like a physical presence then. One by one the delegates bowed, and they truly bowed in submission and respect, and acknowledgement of superior power. We understand, the Lumine representative said, and its voice was small and defeated, and humanity will not be troubled again by our kind. The Vexstar Queen clicked her agreement and said, we have learned our lesson, and we will spread word to all swarms. The Croth delegation bowed lowest of all, and Cross said with genuine respect in his voice, we acknowledge Earth's sovereignty, and we will defend it if others attack. As the delegates departed, Katie stood beside Liana and watched Nightwing curl protectively around his ancient companion. Will they keep their word? Katie asked. They will, Liana said with certainty, and because they finally understand that humanity is not just another species to exploit, to are under our protection now, she continued, and the galaxy remembers what happened to the last civilization that made us choose war over peace. Her eyes grew distant and sad, and she said they are still remembered in the void between stars, and their ghosts scream warnings that no one can hear anymore. Katie shuddered slightly and said, I am glad you are on our side. We chose well, Nightwing rumbled, and his voice was warm with affection, and your species will go far. Katie Morrison, when we are gone, the dragon continued, and when we finally fade into myth and legend and become stories told, 2 children, humanity will carry our legacy forward, he finished, and not as conquerors, but as protectors, and not as tyrants, but as teachers to younger species. Liana rested her hand on Katie's shoulder and said, you asked for respect through diplomacy, and they gave you contempt instead, so we taught them respect through strength, she continued. But remember, Admiral, that the greatest victory is not in winning the war, it is in ensuring the war never needs to be fought again, Liana finished, and her voice carried the weight of ages. She looked up at the stars, and her expression was ancient and tired and infinitely sad. Politeness has limits, she said, but so does cruelty, and so does conquest, and so does the hunger for power. The galaxy has learned where humanity limits are, Liana continued, and now they will have to learn where their own limits should be. Katie nodded in understanding. An Earth final warning had been delivered, and not with threats, but with demonstrations, not with promises of destruction, but with displays of capability, she thought, and the galaxy had learned that humanity backed by ancient powers would defend itself, but more importantly, they had learned that humanity would rather not have to, and that was the most terrifying lesson of Ellen. The years that followed the story of the elf woman and her dragon became legend across 1,000 worlds, and some species told it as a warning, while others told it as hope, but all of them remembered the day they learned that Earth's politeness had limits, and that crossing those limits meant facing something far older and far more powerful and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Liana and Nightwing eventually vanished, as all legends do, and they faded into myth and memory, but their legacy remained in the soldiers they trained and the tactics they taught and the knowledge they shared. The galaxy, for the first time in ages, knew peace, and not because war was impossible, but because everyone remembered what happened when you push too far. Politeness has limits, but wisdom is knowing where those limits are and never testing them.